Let's bring in Hagar Chemali, host of Oh My World on YouTube, and also a former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN. Hagar, always a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. So what are we expecting from these nuclear talks restarting today? And is it indeed going to be a long and very hard and very drawn-out process here?
Thanks, Baker. It's great to see you. Yes, it is going to be a very long slog. And by the way, I was involved in the Iran negotiations when I was spokesperson for the Treasury Department, and we didn't even expect them to take as long as they did at the time, right? Those were for a total about 2 years between behind the scenes channel discussions than the year and a half that it took to get to an actual agreement. The problem now, though, is the reason this is going to take so long is that for a few reasons. First, it's a very different scenario right now. Iran has been further crushed by sanctions imposed by Trump. You have the Biden administration that wants much more than just handling the nuclear deal, given the reaction by the American public under Trump, right? We want to see a deal that doesn't just address the nuclear program, but also their support for terrorism in the region and human rights abuses. So you've got that. You have immense distrust on both sides. And also, Russia and China are part of the negotiating, and things aren't exactly great with them right now. So it's going to be a long slog, and the Biden administration has expressed eagerness to get this through, but doesn't exactly play well when you're negotiating.
Absolutely. And we forget, by the way, there are elections coming up in the next few months in Iran. The expectation is maybe the hardliners are probably going to win that election. Does that complicate this process even more as a result, given the fact that the negotiations could change immensely in the next couple months to be even more strenuous?
It does a little bit. So listen, the hardliners, it's always a threat in Iran, right? That the hardliners are going to come back and that they'll come back in full force. And people argue that when you don't have deals, when we don't work with the Iranians, that if anything, we're just fueling the hardliners. And that may be true. It may make things a little bit more difficult because for the hardliners, the foreign policy that Iran has pursued based on, exporting their influence across the region through supporting militias in Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, terrorist groups, obviously, being involved in Syria, that is a foreign policy that is very strongly held by the hardliners. But that doesn't mean that the Iranian government is all that far off from it either. So while it may make it a bit more difficult, I don't think it'll be an impediment if the U.S. and the other 5 countries who are involved in this, if they are actually able to get an agreement going, the hardliners are not going to end up standing in the way. What they're going to do is make public statements to their people to make it seem that, we're the evil ones and that the Iranians are doing everything they can to support the economy for their people. And that's not entirely true.
What exactly is a perfect scenario for Iran in this? Do they want the sanctions removed? Do they want to have nuclear capabilities? Do they want to go back to how things were in 2015? What at the end of the day is a good deal for Iran?
Yeah, well, if you're asking for Iran's view, they're going to want their cake and eat it too, right? And that's always been the case for Iran right now. But they're pretty aware that they're not going to be able to get the funds from the proceeds of their oil sales. They're not going to be able to get their hands on that unless there's a deal. They know that. Now, we also know that when they get their hands on that money, that a portion of it absolutely goes to supporting terrorism across the region. And that's always been a big problem. It's one of the biggest flaws that you had in the 2015 Iran deal. So for Iran, in terms of what would be an ideal scenario, listen, they're going to want as many sanctions lifted as possible. They say that they want all sanctions that were imposed up to 2018 lifted. The problem is that the Biden administration has said that they are willing to look at to lift nuclear-related sanctions. But terrorism and human rights-related sanctions are a different story. That's going to be, right, Iran is going to have to prove that they're ceasing that activity, that they're not supporting terrorism or human rights abuses. But the Trump administration was not dumb when they imposed these sanctions. And in many cases, they reimposed sanctions on the same government agencies, targets, the central bank, many different parts of the Iranian economy and government. They imposed them under both terrorism authorities in addition to nuclear authorities. And they did that specifically for that reason, to ensure that it would be difficult for them to remove. So when it comes to an ideal situation for Iran, I don't think they're going to get an ideal situation, because they're going to have to learn how to behave enough to have sanctions removed. But it's going to be very tough to get there.
That's very interesting, especially given the fact that, President Trump and the Trump administration always talked about how hideous and awful the deal was. They really campaigned on how terrible the deal was. Did the Trump administration's changes to the plan affect where we're at right now? Like, is Iran in a better situation because of what the Trump administration did, or has it complicated the entire situation here?
And it's complicated. I mean, it's very complicated, and some of it depends on how the Biden administration plays it. So on one hand, Trump withdrawing from this deal has complicated things with our allies, has complicated our standing in the world in terms of being able to trust the United States and pursue negotiations with us in good faith on anything, right? So that's going to be very difficult. The sanctions he has imposed, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, we have more leverage to pull with negotiations with Iran, right? To say, like, listen, we're the ones holding the cards. You want these sanctions lifted, then you're going to have to behave properly. You're going to have to follow the world order, right? So on one hand, there's that leverage, but on the other, the sanctions themselves are so complicated and so heavy, and because they are, you have them imposed under all these different authorities, it's going to make it a very difficult process to pursue. Now, I can tell you, one of my former good friends and sanction nerds, Richard Nephew, is the deputy handling these sanctions, these Iran negotiations. And he knows this stuff inside and out, and he's great. And so I have full faith in him in figuring this out. But I can't stress enough, the Iranians are extremely savvy negotiators. They are very sophisticated in negotiation. As an American of Lebanese descent, I understand it completely. Lebanese are the same way. The last thing the Biden administration should do is express eagerness in this deal. They should make it seem like, look, we want it. It would be great. It would be nice to have, but it's not must have. Let them do the work. Let the Iranians do the work. Let them walk the farther mile to get there. And that's how we'll get to a deal that is somewhat workable. It's not going to be ideal on either side.
Interesting. Very great context there. I can't wait to see what happens with all of this. Hagar Chemali, host of Oh My World on YouTube and a former spokesperson for the U.S. mission to the UN. Always a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.